All right, I think we are live. Give me a few seconds. Put on the stream, right? Please comment in the chat if you can hear me, see. Okay, you say it's okay. If you can hear me, that's... Yeah, right, okay. So thanks for the comments. Let's start. Welcome everyone to our online session with our expert today. Details at the beginning, we are with Mark app, which is being live streamed to YouTube. Follow us. There is like delay, so it takes some time to see new comments. But if we have a problem with the connection, I create a new link, so please don't panic. We'll try not to panic, and please be patient. I will generate a new link, and I will try to share it through any possible channels with you, so that we make sure that you're back online with us. The lecture will take about 60 minutes. Our guest will have some opening ideas, speech and presentation, and then the floor is open for our questions. So let's use this opportunity that we are live now. Many more people will then watch the recording, but they will not have, obviously, the opportunity to ask the questions. So let me please bring in Mark Galeotti, who's with us here. Hi, Mark.
Hi there.
So thank you very much for joining us. Mark Galeotti is an expert on Russian politics and crime, and he's a senior research associate of the Royal United Services Institute. Mark quite recently published a book with the title "We Need to Talk About Putin: Why the West Gets Him Wrong and How to Get Him Right." This book is also available in Czech language. Mark, please, would you share with us a couple of thoughts to start with? Just to let the others know, Mark was talking to us some 3 years ago, I think. So it would be interesting to hear from you some updates on the situation. This program is part of the Transitions Educational series, where we provide workshops and trainings to students and experts in the field of disinformation, misinformation, and fact-checking, and these live lectures are part of it. We just want to provide many different perspectives on the still debated topic of disinformation and misinformation. All right, Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Super. Thanks very much indeed. Well, okay. Yes, I am essentially a Russia specialist, and particularly I've been looking at Russian security affairs, and at the moment there is this whole discussion about Russian information warfare being waged against the West and so forth. And so what I really want to do is just look at three separate sections. One is why do we, in my opinion, have this current crisis? Secondly, what can we do about it? And thirdly, what do I think that the future may well hold? And I think if we look at the last 5 years, what's really striking is that on the one hand, look, disinformation, propaganda, fake news, call it what you will, is nothing new. It's been around really so long as the concept of news and gossip and so forth have existed. I mean, one can track it back to primordial eras. However, what's really changed, or what's really important, I would say, is that three processes came together at the same time to suddenly turbocharge the current challenge. First of all is essentially the changes in the information environment. Now, okay, a lot of that is connected to the internet, where all of a sudden, whereas once upon a time media was a essentially dependent on a relative handful of outlets, each of which had their gatekeepers, newspaper editors or proprietors, TV channel editors, and so forth. There were actually sort of people who really could control a large proportion of the media, certainly on a national level. Now suddenly everyone with a Twitter feed or an Instagram site is in some ways a media outlet. And what's more, rather than just simply thinking it purely as a kind of old media versus new media, in many ways the old media has had to adapt. I mean, how many news stories are basically started by a tweet and not even just Donald Trump's? How often do we find on, for example, television that they're going to be using footage that people have uploaded onto Facebook or Instagram or wherever? I mean, in many ways, what's happened is actually we have seen a new mediaification of the old media as well. And that means because it prioritizes speed over everything else. The scope for old-fashioned fact-checking and so forth has become increasingly squeezed. Because people feel they need to be out there fastest. No point being the second person with a story. So that's an degree in which actually sort of technology has basically reshaped the commercial and practical environment. The second thing that's happened is this whole new Cold War, hot peace, call it what you will, but in this geopolitical conflict, which really since 2014 has sharpened between Russia and the West. And the reason why that's significant is Russia, which is in so many ways outgunned by the West, literally and metaphorically. It's a country with a gross domestic product the size of Spain's. It's a country with very, very little soft power. It's a country with technological challenges, let alone demographic ones. For all these reasons, Russia is relatively weak, but it is trying to essentially force the West to treat it as a great power. And to do that, it has adopted a strategy of not direct confrontation. I have no belief that there are going to be Russian tanks rumbling into Europe, but instead trying to use a whole variety of political warfare instruments. And their aim is to what? It's to divide the West, because Russia is stronger than most Western countries on an individual basis. It's just weaker than the West as an alliance. So it wants to divide us within countries and between countries, opening up existing fissures, existing gaps. Secondly, it wants to distract us. The Russians have this sense that modern democracies are basically attention deficit disorder countries. That today we're really interested in this, we're really bothered about this crisis, we must do something, and then suddenly, oh, shiny, something else catches our eye. Whether it's migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the latest tweet from Trump or whatever. This sense that basically modern democracies and the publics and the elites are very easily distracted. So that's what they're trying to say. No, nothing to see here in Russia, nothing to see here in Ukraine. Look at that other crisis. And the third thing the Russians are trying to do is to demoralize us, essentially to make Russia look so formidable, so unpredictable, and so dangerous that those people who say, look, we need to make some kind of a deal with Putin because otherwise terrible things could happen, are basically sort of empowered. So for all these reasons, they have sought to basically launch an information warfare campaign against the West. But the reason they can do that is not because they have magical mind control powers. I mean, I think a lot of the writing about the Russian information threat dramatically overstates the reality. The reason they can do this is because anyway, the West is going through a generalized legitimacy crisis at the moment. Do we trust our political elites? Do we trust our media? Are contemporary forms of democracy, which really rooted in the late 19th century, still valid in the 21st century? What's the future for Europe? Is America going to be continuing to look towards Europe or pivot towards Asia? Loads and loads of questions, throwing the current status quo into crisis. And what the Russians are doing, and really all they can do, is identify the various fault lines and just help squeeze them open a little bit. I'm not saying that's not serious. I'm not saying that can't be problematic, but I think we have to realize the extent to which it's because suddenly we're all in the same information sphere. Basically, we all use the same social media. We can all present ourselves. I can create an online persona that presents me as someone other than Mark in London. combined with this current geopolitical crisis, combined with the legitimacy crisis, is what's really created this current environment. So what could we possibly do about it? Well, look, one of the classic responses is exactly myth busting, this idea that we have to call out all these various lies and so forth. Look, there are some myths that absolutely need to be busted, but I must admit I'm really quite skeptical about that approach. First of all, because it's a very bureaucratic approach. I mean, I think states love it because it lends itself to metrics. We busted 53 myths last week and we're going to do 74 this week, without really thinking, okay, but has this changed anyone's opinion? Because what we have to understand is, look, a lot of people, frankly, don't trust established authority. Quite the opposite, actually. If a government agency or something else that is considered to be part of the establishment says, oh, no, that's not true, they'll say, well, that's what they want us to believe. Shows there's something in it or whatever. And besides, many of the people who we want to reach out to would not follow a government or pro-government Twitter feed or website or whatever else. So much of this myth busting actually is preaching to the converted, preaching to people who are already on your side. It's also, look, you can't track down every lie and prove it to be wrong. That is a little bit like thinking, well, there's a hole in the roof and the rain is pouring in, and we're going to flick every raindrop away before it reaches us. Now, you might be able to do that in the Matrix movies. In real life, it's not going to happen. So really, the honest answer is we fix the roof. We fix that hole. These are very, very long-term issues we have to address. Everything from education, literacy, media literacy for the public. So they actually have some sense of the fact that just because someone says so and it looks like a very sort of shiny website doesn't mean it's true. Just because someone presents you with links and images doesn't necessarily mean it's true. How do you actually interrogate the material? Secondly, it's about working out some proper means of regulation that strikes that balance between essentially giving governments too much power to decide what is true and what is false. But on the other hand, at the moment, we have platforms that basically can produce whatever they want or allow other people to produce whatever they want. And then maybe, yes, a day or a week or a month later, they'll come around and they'll take down a website that is spreading conspiracy theories, that is pushing forward rumors, that is, in some cases, actively presenting xenophobic ideas. But the damage has been done by then. Now, for some people, the answers are things like, for example, artificial intelligence. And this is, my last sort of section that I want to talk about is moving on to, okay, what does the future offer? And then sort of to do some wrap-up comments, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Well, technology we need to be careful about. I mean, there are some people who are absolutely convinced that technology is going to be the solution to everything, that smart systems, artificial intelligence will be able to nail down which is a fake news story and quickly spike it before anyone gets to see it. Well, maybe. However, first of all, look, a lot of the problem is not fake news. It's not people just making stuff up. Well, sure, people are making stuff up. But a lot of it rather is about selective presentation. Let me give a kind of quite specific example. I spent a certain amount of time looking at RT, the Russian TV, foreign language TV, and clearly a propaganda channel. And that includes talking to people who work for RT. This is the interesting thing. There are still a lot of people, particularly Westerners, who started working for RT when, to be perfectly honest, it was a pro-Russian state channel, but it wasn't by any means awful. It was, I wouldn't say the BBC, but maybe at the level of CNN International or Al Jazeera is probably a better example. But now that RT has become such a sort of poster child for evil Russian disinformation, essentially their CVs have become toxic. Unless, I don't know, maybe if you want to go and work for Radio Pyongyang, you could. But if you want to move into another job in a proper reputable media institution, you don't have a chance. So they're stuck there. And talking to them, I mean, what's clear is that the way that RT works more often than not is not just making stuff up. It's deciding which story will we highlight, which particular aspect are we going to emphasize, and what kind of analysis will we lay over that. Now, fake news is not a straightforward binary. It's not a, this is a truth, this is a lie. It's often, well, okay, how have you chosen to represent that? What is the context you give? What is the way that you have helped people try to understand it? If there are 10 knife crimes in London next month, you could present that as a, dangerous London overcome with immigrants, subject to a new horde of knife criminals, and everyone is terrified. Or you could present it as, well, this time last year, there were 15 knife crimes. So the fact that there's 10 represents a step forward, and it shows that the authorities are working with community groups to actually get a handle on the problem. Context is all, and that, on the whole, artificial intelligence is not foreseeable future anyway, going to fix. Actually, though, what artificial intelligence can do is precisely make the faking all that much more effective. And especially when it's connected with such technologies as deep fakes, which allow you to create what look like realistic video of a person saying something or an event happening. We are still primitive beasts. We still think that seeing is believing. Well, increasingly, that's not going to be the case. So my big concern is that the technology is actually going to help the fakers, not the counter-fakers. So, well, do we just simply throw up our hands and say we can't do anything? Well, no. I think instead we have to realize, well, there is no going back to the old ways. And we have to remember that the old ways were actually often deeply problematic. There is a sense of a kind of a golden age of Western media, when the New York Times and the London Times and the Guardian and so forth were great sort of beacons of truth, and there is a certain amount of truth in that. But of course, I mean, the old ways are also the ways of Pravda and Izvestia. They're also the days of Soviet and Soviet bloc state control. We still see it now in terms of Chinese state control. We have to adapt to the fact that the future is plural. The future is one in which actually people are going to get quite used to accessing a whole variety of different news sources and news platforms. And in some respects, this is why, bizarrely, I think actually what happened in the Soviet bloc gives us some clues as to the way forward. Give a specific example. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, they basically didn't say that it had happened. They denied there's any Soviet troops there. And for several years, they kept up that pretense, really until essentially Gorbachev came along. And at first they could do that. There was splendidly cynical in Pravda. They literally just had a small note just simply saying, a new page in Soviet-Afghan relations has opened, which is one way of describing a massive invasion following the assassination by special forces of the Afghan president. And at first, fine. And there were a relative few Soviet and East Europeans who were listening to the BBC or Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty and so forth, and could hear the news from beyond. But even then, so their state was telling them that there were no Soviets in Afghanistan. Maybe the BBC was telling them that there was. Perhaps they believed the BBC. But it was a very kind of abstract belief. It was a weak one. But of course, what happened after a while is people started coming home, or not coming home. The boy down the street who comes home in a wheelchair because a mine outside Kabul blew his legs off. He may not be instantly sort of talking about it, but nonetheless the word will get out. Or worse yet, the other boy down the street who came home in a zinc box. And yes, they're told, no, it was just an accident on a training exercise, but the word gets out. Gossip and the grapevine and people's personal experiences were set against state-controlled media. And when it came down to it, personal experiences won. People believed what they heard. And now, okay, that also led to all kinds of kind of rumors and such like. But people had got used to the fact that essentially everything that they could be told through official media could well be a lie. Trust but verify became a benchmark. Well, in some ways, I think we are edging into that world ourselves. One in which actually, people will have to get used to the fact that you cannot believe any one source, that you need to triangulate, that you need to look at multiple ones. There is no one place to go. Because even myth-busting, in my opinion, often, and which kind of is an extension of fact-checking, often can become politicized. Let me give an example. Voice of America have a service, name I've forgotten offhand, which fact-checks Russian media claims, and says true, mostly untrue, false. Well, okay, that's fine, and often they carry out very serious investigations. But again, even that is ultimately about a series of political choices. First of all, why just Russian? I mean, there are lots and lots of countries with media who are particularly infused by the government to spread disinformation. It's a political choice to go for the Russian ones rather than just simply the Chinese or the Saudis or whoever. Secondly, often when you look at what they pick particularly easily disproved ones, rather than in the ones that are more complex and actually where there's more discussion. The implication must be, and I must admit this is my view, is that actually this is less about bringing truth to the media and more about being able to point fingers and say, you see, the Russians lied again, and we caught them. So it's going to be an incredibly complex world. It's going to be one in which individuals are going to have to understand how they do not contribute actively or inadvertently to spreading lies, rumors, myths, falsehoods, in which platforms will have to be essentially, we have to find new ways of making sure that platforms can be required to address this whole problem. But most of all, consumers are going to have to get their act together, and we're going to have to help them, and it's going to need education and everything else. But they're going to have to get their act together to be able to understand how the fact that in the modern world, everybody is lying to everybody else, which is, I thought, a really nice kind of uplifting note to end this kind of presentation bit, and to open it out to questions or responses or discussion from the rest of you. Now, at the moment, yes, all I can see is private chat. I can't see the general chat, but the technology
sure,
will, I'm sure,
I'll follow that.
Work out.
Yeah, sure, I'll be following that. So yeah, please, and feel free to post it in the chat. There might be some delay, so let me ask first. What do you think? I mean, you touched on, yes, if fact checking and debunking every piece or some crazy information might not be the one of doing that. Have we seen any effective responses years by different actors, even governments, institutions, NGOs, that managed to effectively address this issue of disinformation, not necessarily coming just from Russia, but I mean, maybe in general? So, what would be the effective responses that you would, if you can expand on that, please?
Sure. 2 points, or two sort of examples. One, a very specific one. A few years back, there was a so-called Lisa case in Germany, which was that a German-born girl claimed that she had been abducted and raped by migrants from the Middle East. I can imagine this was a very, very inflammatory issue. And look, in hindsight, it was clear that it basically turned out to just simply, it was a girl who'd been out, I think with her boyfriend, and had been caught out and basically came up with a lie to try and explain what had happened. It's not that it was part of some grand Russian scheme or whatever. But the point is, she was Russian born. And it fit the Russian narrative at the time. They were trying to inflame this notion that, oh my God, the real threat is from migrants from the Middle East and refugees and asylum seekers. And the Russian, first of all, local media within the Russian German community picked up on it. Then the Russian media started to magnify it. And then even actually the Russian foreign ministry got involved, with the foreign minister saying, oh, the Germans really need to address this. And this was really potentially dangerous, precisely because it hit at a particularly inflammatory time. And it's exactly the kind of story which could lead to serious and violent interethnic tensions. And this was actually a case where, a myth was worth busting. Most of the stories, it's really not worth it. This was clearly going to, beginning to be played out on the streets. And what happened, we actually had a very, very quick and very effective response, not from the government. I mean, yes, obviously the government said, no, it's not true. But, the real thing actually was coming from the media investigating this and actually bringing the truth to light and allowing the government to then simply say, well, yes, the media have shown the truth. And in a way, the government was then simply another consumer of it. So it came from the media, from groups that didn't obviously have an agenda. And that speaks to a second point I'd make is, well, one of the reasons they were able to do that very effectively was, instead of this being, big name correspondents and TV crews from Berlin dealing with it or whatever, a lot of it was being pushed by local media, local activists, individuals who are active in the local community, and that is what's really effective. And I think we've seen a variety of cases where that is the case, because actually, given that trying to fight myths is inevitably a contest, your narrative against someone else's narrative, and most people think, well, I don't necessarily know who to believe. But when they see people in their own community being involved in the myth busting, people in their own community are the ones coming forward, and not just simply being interviewed on the end of a mic, but actually being the people doing investigations, writing about it, talking about it, driving the story, that tends to be much, much more effective. And I think this is the thing, we need to move away from a purely top-down sense of it. Some bunch of people in an office in Brussels who produce the EU Stratcom report East on all these Russian lies. Okay, fair enough, but that's just people from Brussels. But when it's people people who live in 3 streets along from you, people who are also involved, that tends to be much, much more powerful. Right. Actually, I can see some questions now.
I think I'll skip to the question. Karel, I will ask we will address your question, but I think the question from Hannah is actually preaching to the converted. Could you expand on how, if at all, it would be possible to speak to those not converted? I mean, you just touched it, right? If it's probably people in your community that you trust, well, that might be an option. But just like how to get people from the community actually being the ones who can be the trusted information that is reliable.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question. So thanks very much, Hannah, for asking it. Yeah, I mean, there's different ways, and obviously there is no kind of magic response. But let me just sort of mention a few. Look, when you're talking to the non-converted, usually that's a variety of different types of people. There are some people who are absolutely firmly committed to an alternative perspective, and you are not likely to get through to them. They are out and out, I don't know, racists who believe that every migrant is a potential rapist, or there were people, conspiracy theorists who think that, of course we know the moon landings were faked and whatever else. There are some people who you're not going to get through, but that's a very, very small minority. Then there are people who essentially, are feeling that the regular media does not speak to them, feeling that basically the regular media does not wish to speak to them. And I think this is one of the problems, because we tend to get a lot of demonizing. We tend to get a lot of people basically talking about, whether it's, Russian useful idiots, or I mean, look, another example. I lived in New York for 7.5 years, and basically New York is a very, very liberal city, and basically everybody I know there is monstrously hostile to Trump, regards Trump with horror, and I must admit I share that view. But what really strikes me is often when they are, because a fair number of them are involved in the media and the cultural sphere and so forth, when they talk about or write about people who follow Trump, who believe Trump, and who believe the kind of nonsense that he often peddles, they are incredibly dismissive. It's reflective of when Hillary Clinton called them a basket of deplorables, basically saying that these are kind of moral imbeciles. Well, that's never going to convince people. More or less just saying, you believe that because you're stupid or evil. It's not going to have people saying, oh gosh, well then tell me how it really is. No, it entrenches people. So often it's about reaching out to people and saying, well, okay, what do you want us to talk about? What actually do you think is important? Because the thing is, this is often what the disinformation peddlers do. One of the reasons why, for example, RT is disproportionately watched in Scotland compared with the rest of the United Kingdom is because at the time of the Scottish independence referendum, there was a widespread perception that the BBC and the other sort of main UK channels were all very much pushing a London perspective. No, Scotland must remain part of the European Union and so forth, of the United Kingdom and so forth. And RT, on the other hand, was inviting Scottish nationalist politicians on. In due course, it gave their leader a TV program of his own, and very much kind of featuring their issues. And people thought, okay. They didn't think, I want to hear Moscow's view. What they thought was, okay, here is someone who wants to hear my view, who is actually talking to my kind of issues. You can do that without totally becoming one with the disinformation agenda. So basically move into and start addressing their issues insofar as you can. That will tend to win an audience. Third point I would make is this. Most of the kind of real practical disinformation that happens is not because people are watching RT or Chinese outlets or whatever. It's because these are being repeated, retweeted, rerun by all kinds of different outlets. Because again, often the disinformation merchants are very clever about this. They allow you to repost their stories without expecting you to pay them or even cite them. They allow you to reuse their photos, their videos, and such like, because they want you to reuse it. So actually, again, if we take the Czech Republic, most of what is identified or regarded as Russian-inspired news content is not coming from Russian media sources. It's coming from Czech websites and things, things like Parlamentní listy and such like, that are just simply recycling it. Now, when I was living in Prague, I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. Let's look at this, and particularly I meant the Parlamentní listy, the one I mentioned. And what it became clear is when you look at it, it's not that it's recycling the kind of Russian fake news stories because it has an ideological commitment to Russia. It's because it has an advertising-driven budget. It needs click-throughs, and therefore it needs exciting, dramatic, counter-mainstream stories. And the Russians provide a lot of that, and as I said, they provide it for free. So they run a lot of that. But, even talking to people there, I mean, it is clear that that is not an ideological choice. It is because often that's the only way they can get attention. And it's also because these people are being ignored. And this is kind of moving slightly on from sort of how do you speak to the not converted. But one of the things that always strikes me is the people who precisely are recycling fake news. We should be thinking about them. We should be talking to them. We should be trying to kind of bring them in. Again, not treating them with hostility, unless we can absolutely prove that they are knowing, willful people trying to spread a particular propaganda line. But most of them are not. Instead, make them feel they're listened to. Woo them rather than isolate them. This is a long-term challenge. But the point is, so much of the problem at the moment is that there are groups, there are individuals, from people running news sites to people reading news sites, who feel excluded from the mainstream. And we need to show them, not just treat them as fools and morons and moral degenerates, but we need to show them there is a room for them in the mainstream, and that means talking to them.
And because this is an enormous undertaking, right? I mean, many civil society and actors of the public sphere need to be involved in like really rebuilding the trust in democratic institutions. When there are events that are kind of happening quickly, such as elections, well, apparently, yeah, there's not much time to really address all the issues of those who feel marginalized. So in such cases, and we can go back to the cases of Cambridge Analytica, Brexit, like in such like timely, if what the responses could, yes, we do understand that there's a much big base for the discontent of part of the population, but like time pressing cases, what do you think the response is from actors?
To be perfectly honest, in those very, very time sensitive cases, actually, and this is a very depressing answer to give, there isn't much we can do. Again, because otherwise you start to get into the territory of basically state-sanctioned truth. You start saying, no, you're not allowed to talk about X or Y. And although we have efforts to sort of bring in, particularly around elections, laws demanding balance, it's actually very, very hard to really apply those. But you raise a really interesting point with things like sort of Cambridge Analytica. I mean, I think what we also have to realize is that there is an industry. There is an industry around of precisely either disinformation or, shall we say, highly selective use of information. And at the moment, the sanctions and the penalties for that are minuscule. Again, this is the trouble. Laws always take quite a long time to catch up with technological and social change. But I think we do need to pay a lot more attention to actually how we create incentives. Because at the moment, the incentives tend to basically be, if you're good, if you are balanced and honest and whatever, you may get an award. You may well get sort of well treated and highly respected and regarded and so forth. But on the other hand, if you're bad, you may well get a lot of money. And really, sure, maybe some people won't like you. But that doesn't really necessarily change things. We have to think about actually how far we consider the willful, the knowing spread of disinformation, and particularly the use of it for commercial purposes, in other words, to make money. How far is that not similar to, for example, espionage or corruption? How far is this not someone who is precisely attacking some of the fundamental structures and values of our system, just simply because they make money, and quite possibly they will be making money from, which is provided by foreign actors. If one looks at Cambridge Analytica, the financial flows, quite how that was paid, are very opaque. But it does seem to be clear that certainly some of their operations in the UK, it's actually money that came from the United States. Well, this surely is at the very least to be considered illegal lobbying, and at worst to be considered something much more. So, I mean, again, I think the thing is, because we are in a world in which all information, all news, all opinion forming has become monetizable, as well as weaponizable, we actually have to find legal structures that treat that a lot more seriously, but do so without just simply moving into the realms of just simple pure censorship.
Thank you. We have another question. Let me bring it up. Do you have some good idea how to educate media literacy for public as a whole, not just for the students, but also for information's mainstream channels? Would it actually work?
I'm going to give you a rather unusual parallel. Campaign against smoking. which has been in the West, I mean, obviously highly variable in different countries, but actually there has been dramatic success in tackling smoking, and this has been, in part it's by raising the price on cigarettes, adding lots and lots of extra taxes, and also by well-meaning public information campaigns and putting photos of diseased lungs on cigarette packets and everything else. But one aspect of it that really is quite striking is not just simply that smoking became something that basically you couldn't really show in a positive light in films and TV, but also certainly in the UK, and I know some European countries, I'm not sure all of them. But what happened is we also started to see essentially anti-smoking lines being brought in as storylines within popular soap operas and sitcoms and so forth, which on one level one could think of as state interference in the media. Well, so be it. But the point is that, it wasn't about just simply sort of having people suddenly sort of look to camera and say, don't smoke. It was about bringing in storylines about, perhaps in this, there'll be someone who was suddenly diagnosed with lung cancer. In there might be sort of lines about someone saying, oh, I like so-and-so, but I can't stand the fact that they're always smoking or whatever. Simply as a way of slowly building up public awareness. And there's been some interesting research done about this that shows that it's not actually as if people suddenly see this in a soap opera and think, oh my God, I must stop smoking. What it is more, it begins to get people, in effect, asking the questions. Actually, does that mean that I smell unpleasant because I smoke a lot? Does that mean that actually my health is much more at risk? In a way that actually the public information campaigns, people get very good at tuning out. The government is just telling you some new thing, whatever. However, once you become sensitized to the issue, then you might well, and you do, according to this research, pay more attention to the public information campaigns. Then you're more likely to Google the problem and so forth. And, for a lot of people, they're not going to change their habits after all. Others are, though. And in fact, this is part of the complex of measures which actually have really quite effectively dealt with smoking. I mean, again, not ended it, but really made a dent, and particularly shifted the dynamic so that on the whole, it's not seen as cool by younger people who are going to be the parents of the future. Now, if we move that into the realms of disinformation, I mean, I think why this is an interesting approach to actually bring in lines, which, storylines and so forth, which really emphasize that actually seeing is not necessarily believing, and not everything you see on the internet is true and such like, is exactly that then it sensitizes an audience who then can be are more willing to listen to the sort of the government and experts and all these other resources. Now, again, none of this is quick. Again, this is the problem. This is all about long-term social engineering, really. But nonetheless, I think it is really important that we get on top of it and realize that it can be done, but it's going to be an incremental process. And it also means actually we're going to have to think about how this is tackled in school. That's one of the really important areas. And increasingly, I mean, again, in the UK, I think it's still called personal and social education. We have classes that try and make kids alert to all kinds of different issues, ranging from saving money to sexual politics. Well, there's room for disinformation to be fitted in there. So yes, students and so forth, but we can also address it by having storylines and drop-ins into popular media as well.
Thank you. We'll be slowly wrapping back to you, Karel. You have a very specific question, but maybe Mark, if you can expand on it, the question is how to deal with deepfake videos, but is the kind of current panic appropriate, or what do you think about that?
I mean, it's always difficult talking about emerging technologies. Because you will get the boosters who say that in 3 years' time people will be producing videos that are absolutely indistinguishable from reality. And then you see the reality, and I'm thinking, sort of actually how it is now, and I'm thinking actually it's still got a fair way to go. It's worth, though, on the other hand, taking the worst case scenario for the moment. Let's assume that what are currently still quite questionable technologies actually will quickly mature and will be ones that are very, very difficult to prove. Now, again, some people have said, aha, once again, artificial intelligence will be able to solve this. Well, maybe. We'll have to see. There will basically be a kind of an arms race of technologies, the fakers against the defakers, and we'll just see probably some of the time one will have the advantage and some of the time the other. So I think it's more generally about, again, as part of this kind of wider sense of media understanding, media literacy, is getting people to appreciate that video is not the be all and the end all. It does not necessarily prove anything. And again, in some ways we've been here before. I mean, that there is still, I mentioned this kind of great conspiracy theory that says, oh well, actually, astronauts never landed on the moon. It was always a carefully manufactured fake. There are people who genuinely believe that the Earth is flat, and that the films, footage that we've seen from orbit and so forth is, again, it's all a fake. The interesting thing is, you might say, up to now, it's been the conspiracy theorist vanishingly small minority, the extremists, whom we regard as extreme because they don't accept that they don't accept video evidence. Increasingly, we're probably going to be moving into a future in which actually the majority of us will have to learn not to accept video evidence, or not accept video evidence in its own terms. And so I think this is the way we're going to have to get. It makes it sound as if the future is incredibly paranoid. And the sad truth of the matter is, I think that's the way it's going to be. Our survival, in terms of in face of all the various technologies and means of fake news, will depend on a suitable level of habitual paranoia.
All right, thank you. Well, it's again uplifting, but I mean, yeah, let's be real about it, right? Let's be realistic on what's coming up. Now let me check just the YouTube stream if there's some new comments, but I don't see them. So unless anybody has additional comment, we will wrap up. Thank you, Mark, very much for your talk.
My great pleasure.
We'll look up your book in the bookstores in Czech, and maybe that's going to be one of the channels also, how to open this topic with wider audiences in the Czech Republic and maybe older audiences as well. So good luck with your research, good luck with your work, and hope to talk again soon.
Thank you very much, and good luck to everyone in their sort of future careers.
Thank you. And last comments on or invite for tomorrow. Tomorrow we have another lecture at 7 p.m. Prague time. We will have Christian Triebert from the New York Times and Bellingcat sharing some of the case studies. So please join us again. If we don't have your emails, or if you joined through some shared message, feel free to post or send an email to j.valuch@gmail.com. And well, we have a question from Pavel. I don't want to take this opportunity away from him, so let's address this question as well. What should be the government level response of countries targeted by the foreign state orchestrated disinformation campaigns?
Good and timely question. Okay, well, on the one hand, let's be perfectly honest that we need to be very sure about that these are state-orchestrated disinformation campaigns. Governments have different perspectives. Different countries will put forward their own narratives. That happens all the time. We can hardly sort of complain that a Saudi news agency is going to have a different take on the world than a Belgian one. That an American American media outlet will look at the world differently from a Chinese one. So let's understand that. However, I mean, it is clear that there are times when there are actually not just sort of different perspectives, but outright disinformation and being directed towards a country. I think we have to appreciate that information war is more than just simply a snappy title. It reflects what happens. Put it another way, I mean, this fits into the overall category that the Russians, like the Soviets before them, would call active measures. In other words, covert operations intended to bring about certain political impact in another country. And in many ways, I think we should be treating it just as much the same as we would, attempts at corruption or whatever. Now, clearly, often we're not necessarily going to be expelling someone from an embassy or something like that. But I think that there have to be sanctions, in the sense of that there has to be some kind of penalty. If we see that there are particular outlets, particular channels being used, well, that is not the job of a news agency. That is the job of a propaganda network. And if it's a propaganda network, not a news agency, then it shouldn't have the privileges of a news agency. I'm questioning. I don't, for example, like the idea of trying to bar RT, because on the whole, RT is not involved in any kind of covert activity. But on the other hand, if disinformation is being spread in a covert way, if outlets are, particularly if they're being paid to push forward a particular line, then that should be considered a hostile intelligence operation. But the key thing is this: look, it's very tempting to think of this as, oh, this is a terrible attack that is being levied upon us. Actually, often the best way of addressing that is to tackle it head on and treat it as a case study in why you actually need to build the legitimacy within your own population. Let me give a particular example of how the Dutch responded. It wasn't disinformation, but I think it's a good use of how a government can operate. When Russian spies were caught trying to hack in remotely into the OPCW, the chemical weapons watchdog, in The Hague. And in many ways, I think how the Dutch responded was an absolute case study in how you deal with these kind of situations, in the sense of they very, very quickly were as transparent as they possibly could with the public. They didn't just simply say, oh, it's a security matter. Yes, we arrested Russian spies, but we can't tell you anything about it. No, they presented all the information that they could, including exactly video and photos of the individuals, of the car they were using to try and hack in, and so forth. So high levels of transparency, very, very quick response, and they turned it also into a subject of mockery and ridicule. They made a joke of it. They laughed at it. I mean, now, for example, that car is now an exhibit, part of an exhibit in this whole effort. Instead of just getting all very kind of, oh my God, what are the Russians doing? They actually instead laughed at them. They made sure that there was a penalty, that the individuals concerned were deported, and that the material on their laptops were obviously sort of taken and used by the Dutch intelligence services. But basically, they used it to fight back. That's something that I think we often don't do. Yes, fine, try and kind of close down covert channels and penalize people who knowingly take money to spread disinformation, but also use it to fight back. The Russians do what they do, and others spread disinformation because on the whole, they don't see a downside to it. Well, if the downside was just everyone starts laughing at you, or everyone just starts thinking of you as morally bankrupt or not able to tell the truth, or whatever. We've seen this also with the MH17 case, in which the Russians were very, very aggressively pushing a whole variety of different narratives. And actually, those have been comprehensively dismantled, I mean, including by Bellingcat, who you'll be hearing from next, the main thing is to show that there is a national cost to being identified as a source and a pusher of disinformation. That's something that's very important, and that has to be done not just by individual countries, but by whole groups and alliances. We tend to see that at the moment, the EU, NATO, well, it wouldn't be NATO, but the EU and other alliances do not really step in. Actually, countries should say, hang on, you did this to our neighbor and our ally and our friend, and we're also going to join in terms of reviling you for it or whatever. Again, it's about making sure there are costs to the country to being caught in this. Sorry for my long rambling answer.
No, that's totally fine. And I think this was a more uplifting second ending of our lecture. So thank you, Pavel, for your question. And thank you, Mark, for showing some case study from the Dutch. So I invited already everyone to the lecture with Christian Triebert, but we will have a third lecture. We still don't have a specific time, so we will share it. But the third speaker will be Professor Matthew Hinman. He's more on political communication, digital audiences, and online disinformation. And he's an author of a book called The Internet Trap, How the Digital Economy Builds Monopolies and Undermines Democracy. So I do believe that Professor Hinman's talk perspective to the topic we are discussing. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Sorry for any hiccups, if there were any with the connection, but I think it went smooth. So have a nice evening and hope to see everyone soon online or offline.